In the summer of 1981, 7-year-old Michael Scott was standing on the front porch of his family's home in El Paso, Texas, in a neighborhood where kids still played outside and nobody locked their doors. A few minutes later, he stepped off the porch, walked toward the familiar street, and vanished. No cry for help, no signs of a struggle. No one saw the final moment. The El Paso Police Department received the report that same day. Dozens of officers were deployed, and the neighborhood was searched alley by alley. Michael was not found. The family was told there was a chance he had simply gotten lost. There was also a chance someone had taken him very quickly. Neighbors started talking. Some said they had seen a stranger. Others said nothing unusual had happened. The search went on for days and then stopped. The file grew thicker but made no progress. Michael Scott was added to Texas's list of missing children with unknown causes. His parents continued living with the assumption that their son would probably never return. In another state, a boy grew up with a different name. No clear birth certificate. No fully explained past. Just a persistent feeling that something in his life wasn't right. Nearly 20 years later, an administrative procedure required identity verification. A biological sample was entered into the federal system. An unusual match appeared. El Paso was mentioned again, and a case once considered unsolvable had to be reopened from the beginning. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part, where residential neighborhoods stretching out under the dry Texas desert sun still felt almost completely safe. Kids played in yards without adults hovering nearby. Neighbors knew each other's faces, and people believed that bad things only happened somewhere far away, not on these quiet streets. The Scott family lived in a neighborhood like that, in an ordinary single-story house, neither rich nor poor, where days passed in a stable and predictable routine. Daniel Scott went to work regularly. Rebecca Scott handled the household and cared for the children, and their life had no major upheavals, no serious conflicts, no signs that a tragedy was about to happen. 7-year-old Michael Scott was a true child of that neighborhood, familiar with every corner of the street, every empty lot, every neighbor's house nearby, with a habit of playing around within the allowed boundaries, knowing to come home on time, and rarely venturing far from adult sight. Michael wasn't a rebellious kid or one who ran off. On the contrary, he followed the simple rules set for him and believed the world around him was safe. That afternoon, everything unfolded as usual. Michael was near the house, in a space the whole family considered familiar and worry-free, and the person directly supervising him looked away for just a moment, short enough that no one thought it was a dangerous decision. It was in that brief window that something unusual appeared, not clear enough to cause immediate panic, not resembling an open threat, just a strange presence, a situation outside the neighborhood's daily routine. The adults' initial reaction wasn't fear but hesitation, reassuring themselves that it might be a misunderstanding, that there was no reason to intervene right away, because everything around them was still too normal, too quiet to think the worst. There was no cry for help, no signs of a struggle, no image strong enough to trigger the instinct for danger that usually only kicks in when the threat is obvious. In the minutes that followed, Michael was no longer where he had been standing. His absence was at first explained by familiar assumptions, like he had run to a neighbor's house, or gone to another nearby play spot. Assumptions that fit his past habits and the way the whole neighborhood still operated. The initial search happened spontaneously, in a very small area, with the thought that just a few more minutes and everything would return to normal, that Michael would appear from some corner with his usual carefree look. As time passed without any sign of the boy, unease began to replace the initial calm. Questions were asked of neighbors, familiar spots were checked again, but all answers were vague and uncertain. No one could say exactly what they had seen or when. The mistakes didn't come from deliberate negligence, but from years of belief that this was a safe place, that a 7-year-old couldn't completely vanish in just a few minutes in broad daylight. Panic only truly erupted when every reasonable assumption was disproved by the reality that Michael wasn't anywhere in his familiar area. And that's when the family realized too much time had passed to keep waiting. The decision to call the police was made in a state of confusion and desperation, marking the moment the Scott family had to admit that their son hadn't just gotten lost or come home late. He had truly disappeared from their familiar world, closing what seemed like an ordinary afternoon and opening an unfillable void in the family's life. Immediately after the missing person call, the case was officially received and recorded in the El Paso Police Department system, shifting from an unclear civilian situation to an incident requiring emergency response, even though at that moment no one could say for sure what had happened. The case file was processed according to standard procedures for missing children, including Michael Scott's personal information, family address, last seen time, and surrounding neighborhood context, all entered into a records management system that in the early 1980s still relied heavily on paper and manual reports. From the Coordination Center, an initial investigation team was quickly set up, consisting of patrol officers near the area, a juvenile case detective, and a supervising officer responsible for compiling information, with the immediate goal of determining whether this was an abduction or just a child lost for a short time. The team was dispatched to the scene in a context where enough time had passed for the family's worry to be evident, but not enough to trigger stronger response mechanisms typically used only with concrete evidence of a crime. The initial scene was cordoned based on accounts from the direct supervisor and nearby witnesses, focusing on the area where Michael was last seen, and a radius covering streets, paths, and empty lots a 7-year-old could reach in a short time. This cordoning was cautious and relied more on experience than data, since there were no clear physical signs like disturbed belongings or struggle marks to pinpoint the exact start of a criminal act. Officers observed the area, noting lighting conditions, afternoon traffic density, and how far a child could wander if leaving on his own, while also considering routes a stranger could use to approach and leave without drawing attention. Alongside scene cordoning, initial interviews were conducted right at the Scott family home, focusing on Daniel and Rebecca Scott to clarify Michael's daily habits, level of independence, family rules about playing outside, and any recent changes in his behavior. These questions aimed to assess the likelihood of Michael leaving the familiar area on his own, while ruling out or supporting the idea that he might have done something unusual leading to losing contact. Investigators also noted the family's reactions, not to judge emotions, but to check consistency in accounts, because in the earliest stage of any missing person case, understanding family context is seen as key to directing the investigation. Key witnesses in the area, including neighbors and people present around the time Michael disappeared, were approached one by one for information, though most accounts were vague and uncertain, reflecting the nature of a neighborhood where people were used to kids coming and going in view without much notice. These statements were carefully recorded, even though from the start they showed clear limitations. No one could confirm exactly when Michael left sight. No one saw behavior unusual enough to definitively indicate outside interference. During the initial assessment, the team faced a difficult reality. The scene showed no signs of violence, no clear physical evidence, and no factors strong enough to immediately classify the case as a legal abduction in the strict sense. This led to internal discussions about the possibility Michael had gotten lost, been caught up in some play activity, or simply not returned home on time. Hypotheses, fitting how many similar cases had been resolved before. However, alongside these was a growing awareness that passing time was significantly reducing the chances of quickly finding Michael if he had truly left the area or been taken farther than expected. The initial assessment of the disappearance was thus hesitant, not leaning fully one way, reflecting the limits of available information and the investigation system at the time. The team had to operate in an ambiguous space where every hypothesis seemed reasonable, but none strong enough to direct all resources in one direction. In that context, the decision to continue investigating at an urgent level but not fully expand was made as a cautious choice, to avoid depleting resources too early without clear grounds, while keeping the ability to respond if the situation changed. For the Scott family, these initial police steps brought hope that the case was being handled, while exposing a hard-to-accept reality that even law enforcement couldn't yet say for sure what had happened to their son. The initial assessment phase of the investigation was thus not just a set of procedures and administrative decisions, but the first moment the helplessness in the face of missing information became clear, laying the foundation for an investigation that was cautious, slow, and heavily limited right from the first hours after Michael Scott vanished. From the hesitant initial assessments, in the emergency phase, the investigation team's focus quickly shifted to systematically reconstructing the scene to pinpoint exactly where Michael Scott was last seen, because in the absence of signs of violence and clear evidence, anchoring this final point was seen as the only foundation to keep subsequent analysis grounded in reality. Investigators returned to the area where family and witnesses said Michael last appeared, cross-referencing each account with the specific terrain, identifying overlaps between adult lines of sight and children's familiar paths in the neighborhood, thereby narrowing to a tighter space than the initial search radius. This process wasn't just to pinpoint a single spot, but to understand how that space functioned that afternoon, when light was still good, traffic not heavy, and neighbor comings and goings happened naturally, creating windows where a child could leave sight without notice. Once the last seen location was agreed upon relatively, the team began standardizing the timeline, a complex task since accounts relied on rough estimates rather than precise clock times. Each small marker was rearranged in order, from when Michael was seen playing near home, to the moment the supervisor realized he was gone, to the spontaneous search time before police were called, all placed side by side to find overlaps and contradiction. This standardization forced investigators to convert vague phrases like just a few minutes, not very long, or a little while, into specific minute ranges, knowing those numbers always had some error. It was in this process that a key supervision gap gradually emerged, a short but long enough period for Michael to leave the familiar area unnoticed, a gap not tied to any standout event, no cry, no unusual action, just the silent absence of a child in an environment considered safe. This gap became the analysis focus, as it represented the only moment when anything could have happened, from Michael wandering off on a familiar path, being drawn by something external, to possible interference by someone else without clear traces. Based on that supervision gap, parallel hypotheses were proposed and coexisted rather than excluding each other, reflecting the investigation reality without enough information to prioritize one direction. One hypothesis suggested Michael might have left the familiar area on his own, gotten lost or caught in an unforeseen situation, fitting the lack of forced signs in neighborhood kids' habits. Another focused on the possibility Michael was lured by a stranger, a scenario leaving no clear physical marks, but fitting the short gap and quick disappearance. Alongside was a less mentioned but uneliminable possibility, that Michael was intentionally taken in an action discreet enough for no one nearby to notice. These hypotheses were recorded and kept open, not because they were equally convincing, but because available data didn't allow definitively ruling out any. The entire scene and timeline reconstruction happened amid severe 1981 data limitations. No residential surveillance cameras, no electronic records for quick tracing, and reports entirely dependent on human memory and manual notes. This meant every reconstruction effort accepted unavoidable ambiguity, where boundaries between certain events and reasonable guesses were always blurred. Investigators had to work with incomplete pieces, knowing one small misremembered or overlooked detail could skew the whole picture, yet they proceeded because there was no other choice. Reconstructing the scene and timeline thus didn't yield definitive answers, but it created a common reference frame so later steps wouldn't become scattered, while clarifying a key reality. Michael didn't vanish randomly over a long period, but left sight in a very specific, brief, elusive moment, where lack of data and era technology limits created a gap that from the start challenged every effort to fully explain. From the crime scene framework and the timeline that still had many gaps just reconstructed, the physical search activity was deployed in parallel with desk investigation as an inevitable reflex, because in the context of lacking specific data, directly scanning the surrounding space was seen as the only way to hope for discovering any sign that could lead to Michael Scott's location. Officers along with volunteers started from the residential area where the boy lived, checking every alley, every pedestrian path, the vacant lots interspersed between rows of houses, areas that children often frequented but adults paid little attention to, under the assumption that if Michael had left the line of sight on his own, he could hardly have gone farther than the familiar range in a short time. The search gradually expanded to adjacent areas, including roads leading out of the neighborhood, undeveloped lands, and public spaces within the radius that a 7-year-old child could reach on foot, with each point checked systematically but inevitably relying on visual observation and personal experience. In parallel with the official forces, the surrounding community was mobilized for support, reflecting the characteristics of El Paso at that time, where incidents involving children quickly became a common concern, prompting neighbors, family friends, and members of the local church to voluntarily join the search. Small groups formed spontaneously, dividing up to scan each area, calling Michael's name in hidden spots, checking spaces that a child might curiously enter without thinking of danger, all based on the belief that a large presence would increase the chances of detecting an overlooked sign. During this search process, some of Michael's personal items were discovered scattered in the area, familiar belongings tied to his daily life, and their appearance immediately drew attention as they were the rare physical signs directly related to the boy. However, these items were not enough to determine a clear path, as the locations where they were found did not form a continuous chain, did not indicate a specific direction of movement, and showed no signs of being left behind under any particular circumstance. Analyzing these findings put the investigation team in a difficult position, as while they proved that Michael had been present in the search area, they provided no clues to determine his next steps after that moment. The search activity continued to expand in the hope that another item or a new sign might appear, but the wider the scope, the less likely it was to connect the discovery points into a logical route, making the hypothesis of Michael moving on his own increasingly hard to prove. Meanwhile, the search teams also found no signs that the boy had left the area via a specific route or was being held in a nearby enclosed space, making every physical effort seem to revolve around the same unanswered question. The absence of a clear route forced investigators to acknowledge that the physical search, though necessary, was reaching the limits of its effectiveness, as the space to cover grew larger while specific signs became rarer. In that context, coordination between investigation and search became more difficult, as what was discovered in the field was not strong enough to adjust existing hypotheses, and hypotheses derived from timeline analysis did not lead to any specific search area. The search teams continued operating at high intensity in the early days, but each return without new results highlighted a worrying reality. Michael was no longer within the easily accessible range of the familiar residential area. The community mobilization effort, though demonstrating solidarity and determination, also began to reveal limitations when widespread participation could not compensate for the lack of specific direction, leading to many overlapping or scattered efforts without yielding valuable information. For the investigation team, the lack of convergence between physical search results and desk investigation directions was an early warning signal that this case did not follow the simple patterns of a typical lost child scenario. But at that point, they still lacked the basis to confirm a different script. The parallel search and investigation thus gradually shifted from the expectation of finding Michael in the nearby area to the goal of ruling out the possibility that he was still there. A subtle but important change in approach. By the end of this phase, despite widespread scanning and maximum community resource mobilization, no discovery was strong enough to connect the pieces into a clear picture, and the lack of convergence between investigation and physical search left a concerning gap, signaling that Michael Scott might have left the range everyone once believed was safe and controllable, without leaving any trace clear enough to guide subsequent effort. When the physical search activity yielded no clear route or convergence point, the investigation focus was forced to shift deeper into the system of statements, treating it as the remaining primary data source to reconstruct what had happened in the key gap that the crime scene could not speak for. Statement collection was expanded from initial witnesses to various other sources in the area, including neighbors living along related routes, people coincidentally present that afternoon, small shop owners near the residential area, and anyone who might have observed Michael or unusual elements within the standardized time frame. Each statement was recorded separately, along with the time it was provided, the witness's relationship to the Scott family, and their familiarity with neighborhood routines, to facilitate later comparison and evaluation. As the number of statements increased, the investigation team began cross-referencing information layer by layer, from basic details like time and location, to more subtle factors such as described direction of movement, estimated distance, and surrounding context the witness believed they had observed. This comparison process quickly revealed a prominent characteristic. Most statements were estimative and heavily influenced by unstable memory, as many witnesses used relative, rather than absolute time markers, and frequently adjusted their stories after hearing information from others or local media. Initial overlaps, expected to form a seamless chain of events, revealed significant differences when placed side by side, forcing investigators to be cautious in distinguishing genuine similarities from collective inference. Some statements claim to have seen Michael in different locations within the same short time frame, creating contradictions inexplicable by spatial logic, while others described unusual elements like strangers or unfamiliar vehicles, but lacked consistency in appearance, color, or direction. These contradictions did not necessarily indicate dishonesty, but reflected the natural limits of human memory in situations not deemed important at the time, where details only gained significance after a tragedy was confirmed. The inability to verify these contradictions with physical evidence put the investigation team in a dilemma. Completely discarding a statement could mean overlooking a potential clue, while retaining too many conflicting details diluted the overall picture and hindered investigation direction. To address this, investigators applied legal reliability criteria for statements, considering internal consistency of each account, the time gap between event and reporting, and the witness's actual observation capability at the scene. Statements failing minimum consistency and verifiability criteria were categorized as reference information, while the few with more specific details were retained for further analysis, though even they were not strong enough to stand alone as evidence. This evaluation process highlighted a key limitation of the investigation system at that time. Witness statements, though carefully collected, remained easily deformable fragments over time and circumstance, especially in a case without clear violent events to etch into memory. The use of statements was thus strictly limited to supporting hypotheses rather than serving as the foundation for decisive investigative actions, as any deviation could lead to pursuing a false direction and wasting valuable resources. In that context, the investigation team had to accept that statements, though numerous and diverse, could not alone resolve the case's central gap, but only sketch faint outlines around the disappearance. The absence of a breakthrough statement, combined with unverifiable contradictions, caused witness-based activity to gradually reach its effectiveness limit, forcing investigators to reconsider this data source's role in the overall strategy. By the end of this phase, the statement file had become a dense but unfocused collection, fully reflecting community information gathering efforts, while exposing the fragility of human memory as an investigative tool, especially in a rapid and silent disappearance. Evaluating and limiting statement use was not abandoning this information source, but a necessary adjustment to prevent investigation from being led by unverifiable contradictions, further clarifying a worrying reality. Despite mobilizing multiple information sources, the picture of what happened to Michael Scott remained fragmented, lacking solid anchors, and increasingly dependent on hypotheses untestable with concrete data. When the statement system had been filtered to the maximum yet still failed to produce a clear direction, the investigation team was forced to focus on the scant but more specific layer of information. Scattered descriptions of strangers or unfamiliar vehicles appearing in the area at the time Michael Scott vanished, though from the start they were aware this was a fragile type of lead, easily distorted by unstable memory and post-event fixation. Descriptions were gathered from various statements, mostly not fully matching but sharing certain intersections, such as the appearance of an unfamiliar person not from the neighborhood or an unknown vehicle parked or moving slowly in the area. Details that might be overlooked on a normal day but became notable in the context of a disappearance. The investigation team compiled these descriptions into the most common characteristics possible, eliminating overly specific details lacking cross-confirmation, to create a description framework, broad enough not to miss possibilities, but narrow enough for tracing within available data. However, from the initial step, they faced a major challenge. Significant differences between descriptions, from estimated age of the stranger and physical features, to vehicle color and model, making a unified portrait nearly impossible. Still, some common features were retained as a working basis, not because they were certainly accurate, but because they were the rare elements convertible into search criteria within the administrative systems of that era. Based on these criteria, the investigation team retrieved data from the Texas Department of Motor Vehicles, a completely manual process, in 1981, requiring review of registration lists, by area, vehicle type, and basic features, hoping this cross-referencing could narrow the suspect range. However, DMV data at that time was not designed for complex investigative queries, causing each search criterion to produce long lists of potential vehicles and owners, most with no clear connection to the neighborhood where Michael lived. When criteria were loosened to avoid missing anything, the number of matches surged beyond the investigation force's verification capacity, especially with resources already dispersed across multiple directions. Conversely, tightening criteria to shorten the list risked eliminating a key lead, forcing the team to maintain a fragile balance between coverage and feasibility. The rapid increase in matches revealed a worrying reality. Even carefully compiled general descriptions were too broad to guide investigations specifically, especially in a city with diverse vehicle and population density, like El Paso. Investigators tried narrowing the list by cross-referencing additional factors, like criminal records or frequent presence in the area. But these efforts quickly hit limits due to ineffective interagency data connectivity and slow information exchange. The inability to pinpoint specific suspects was not just a technical failure, but a direct consequence of initial leads too faint to withstand traditional investigative methods. Each time a name or vehicle was added to the checklist, verification led to exclusion due to no direct link to Michael or the disappearance area, causing the suspect list to constantly shift without nearing a conclusion. Over time, stranger or unfamiliar vehicle leads gradually moved from the center of investigative hope to a secondary reference direction, as the team realized continuing to pour resources into an overly broad and imprecise dataset risked delaying other directions also needing attention. The lead reaching a dead end was not sudden, but the result of continuous efforts, yielding no significant narrowing, each verification step only clarifying that the gap between available information and a specific suspect remained too wide. In that context, the investigation team had to note that initial descriptions, though gathered with good faith and high effort, lacked the strength to overcome 1981 data and technology limits to become the case-solving key. Accepting this impasse did not mean completely removing stranger or vehicle leads from the file, but a necessary adjustment to avoid investigation getting stuck in an endless loop of checking and excluding. By the end of this phase, the once-hoped breakthrough lead had become part of the overall picture, but lacking decisive weight, further highlighting a worrying reality. Despite processing multiple information layers, from crime scene, timeline, state to administrative data, Michael Scott's disappearance still had no solid anchor to decisively guide the investigation forward. When clues about strange individuals or vehicles could no longer be narrowed down further through traditional investigative measures, the command was forced to allow the expansion of the case beyond the initial residential area by selectively releasing information to local media, with the dual goal of seeking additional potential witnesses while generating enough public pressure to jog memories or reveal information that previously seemed unrelated. The released information was carefully considered to avoid misleading the investigation, focusing on Michael's basic characteristics, the time and area of the disappearance, and a call for anyone with information, no matter how small, to contact the police. Immediately after the information spread, tips from the public began pouring in at a much faster rate than in the previous phase, reflecting both genuine concern and collective anxiety when a child disappearance case was brought to light. Investigators had to establish a separate process for receiving and screening these tips, categorizing them by specificity, verifiability, and relevance to the established timeframe, to prevent the investigation from being swept away by unverifiable details. However, the large volume of tips quickly revealed the downside of public attention, as much of the information was speculative, second-hand, or formed after the tipster had been exposed to news reports, blurring the line between direct observation and media-influenced memory. The screening process thus became burdensome, as each tip had to be examined carefully to avoid missing a genuine clue, while in reality, most tips added no new data beyond what was already known. The sudden surge in incoming information also caused data overload in the investigation, stretching already tenuous hypotheses in multiple directions, from locations outside reasonable scope to scenarios incompatible with the established timeline. To manage this, the investigative team had to apply stricter exclusion criteria, retaining only information that could directly tie to confirmed locations, times, or characteristics, while archiving the rest as reference material to prevent it from influencing strategic decisions. In this context, expanding the investigation did not mean pursuing every possible avenue. On the contrary, it became a continuous process of narrowing, as each new layer of information was cross-checked against reality and mostly discarded for failing minimum criteria. Leads once considered promising, including the possibility of Michael leaving the area in a specific vehicle or being taken to a particular location, were successively narrowed when unsupported by either physical evidence or reliable testimony. Public and media pressure, while motivating sustained investigative intensity, also put the team in a position of constantly having to demonstrate that all leads were being considered, even as viable options dwindled. Balancing public expectations with the practical limits of available data became a major challenge, as each additional release of information risked sparking new waves of speculation, increasing the volume of low-value tips. Internally, periodic review meetings painted an increasingly clear but unfavorable picture. Everything feasible with available means had nearly been exhausted, and further expansion would only add workload disproportionate to the likelihood of a breakthrough. Nevertheless, the team continued receiving and screening public tips, not out of high expectations for a new lead, but out of responsibility to ensure no detail was overlooked while the case was still considered active. Over time, the absence of a clear breakthrough became harder to conceal, as investigative leads leaned to vague, unverifiable hypotheses. The lack of a strong new clue to shift the landscape turned the expanded investigation from proactive to reactive, focusing more on confirmation and elimination than exploring entirely new directions. By the end of this phase, despite mobilizing widespread attention and processing a large volume of public information, the investigation faced the same reality as in the early days: no direct evidence, no specific suspect, and no data strong enough to break the cycle of hypothesizing and eliminate. Public pressure thus failed to create a turning point, only highlighting the limits of what could be achieved with existing information and technology, leaving an investigation expanded in form but increasingly narrowed in substance, as every feasible path seemed to lead to the same temporary dead end, without resolving Michael Scott's disappearance. After the expanded investigation phase under heavy public pressure yielded no breakthrough, Command was forced to conduct a comprehensive review of everything done since Michael Scott's disappearance, to realistically determine whether the investigation could still progress proactively given current data and resources. Files were re-examined layer by layer, from the initial scene, established timeline, physical search results, witness statement system to efforts tracing strange individuals and vehicles, all placed side by side to see if any overlooked connection or prematurely dismissed hypothesis emerged. This review aimed not to find a new detail, but to confirm that pursued leads had reached their reasonable limits, and that continuing to pour resources into the same old methods was unlikely to yield different results. The internal conclusion gradually formed that no viable leads remained for immediate pursuit, as all collected data was either too vague to act on, or had been systematically checked and eliminated. The absence of physical evidence, reliable legal testimony, and specific suspects left remaining hypotheses speculative, failing to meet the threshold for decisive next steps. In this context, active investigation had to be scaled back, not because the case was downplayed, but because maintaining emergency status without new directions would deplete resources and impact other cases needing attention. Activities like wide-area searches, high-intensity tip processing, and broad administrative data sweeps were gradually reduced to minimum levels, shifting from immediate response to passive monitoring, with focus on preserving files for future use. The decision to classify the file as a cold case was made as a necessary administrative step, more accurately reflecting the case's real status than ending the investigation, though formally it marked a clear shift in priority. Michael Scott's file was reclassified, documents archived per protocol for unsolved cases, and follow-up responsibility transferred from the emergency team to records management, where it would exist as an unresolved case no longer handled daily. This transition happened quietly, without a widely announced specific date, but its impact was quickly felt, especially by the Scott family. In the early stage, The family still received periodic updates, even if without new news, but once the case officially went cold, contact frequency dropped noticeably, police calls became infrequent, and more informational than investigative. The lack of regular updates made the family gradually realize their case had entered a different phase, where hopes of quick resolution were replaced by indefinite waiting, without timeline. For the agency, cold case status meant the investigation no longer appeared in daily workflows, but remained legally open, ready for reactivation if new information strong enough to change the situation emerged. In practice, however, the absence of new leads turned the file into more archived documents than a living case, existing in the system as a reminder of investigative limits when initial data was insufficient. The comprehensive review and status change also exposed systemic weaknesses in the initial investigation, not in participant effort or intent, but in over-reliance on vague testimony and limited administrative data amid primitive technology. Still, acknowledging those limits came without feasible alternatives at the time, making scaling back the only responsible choice. For the Scott family, silence gradually replaced the early days of activity, and the lack of regular information created a new void, different from initial panic but no less heavy, as it tied to the feeling that their case had slipped from active system focus. Going cold thus was not just an administrative term, but a prolonged state where questions persisted without specific pursuit, marking the end of the initial investigative phase, and opening an uncertain period in which Michael Scott's disappearance remained an unresolved reality removed from the urgent operations of law enforcement. While the file on Michael Scott's disappearance was quietly shelved into inactive status in El Paso, in another state far from Texas, the boy's life continued in a completely different form, bearing no signs that he had once been the center of a prolonged and deadlocked search. The victim lived in an area unrelated to El Paso, in a new geographic and social environment where familiar childhood landmarks did not exist, and no one knew the name Michael Scott or the circumstances that brought Brew there. This new life did not begin with an officially recorded change, but formed gradually through daily routines, new relationships, and a different identity used as a matter of course, unquestioned, in a context where children's personal information was rarely scrutinized closely. This substitute identity was not built on full legal foundation, but existed at the minimum needed for the victim to integrate into surroundings, enough to attend school, receive basic medical care, and avoid drawing attention from authority. Using this identity was not linked to any missing person file, as no connected federal data existed to match a child growing up in this state with a cold case in Texas, allowing two information streams to exist in parallel without ever intersecting. In the fragmented administrative system of that era, lack of interstate and interagency connectivity created a gap large enough for a child to grow up undetected, as living outside his true identity. The victim's new living environment bore very different characteristics from the quiet El Paso neighborhood, with its own rules, habits, and pace, forcing early adaptation to standards not drawn from personal memory but from observation and learning. This adaptation happened gradually, not as a conscious process of hiding or evading, but as a natural survival reflex for a child needing to fit in to exist in the new context. In that environment, the victim learned to respond to a different name, accept fragmented personal details like age, birthplace, or family background without opportunity or means to verify against truth, as no clear origin story was established from the start. The lack of origin information did not manifest as a clearly perceived void, but as a prolonged vague state, where basic past questions were not encouraged and gradually became unnecessary in daily life. To those around him, the victim was just a normal child in their community, showing no signs of a disrupted history, as all outward behavior fit the context he lived in. The disconnection from the missing person file also meant no mechanism for the system to self-detect anomaly, as the substitute identity was not cross-checked against national missing children databases, which were limited in scope and technology. The parallel existence of two realities, one a cold case in El Paso, and the other the victim's ongoing life in another state, reflected a systemic gap where lack of data connectivity allowed one story to split into two halves that never met. In daily life, the victim interacted with school, neighbors, and community activities like any other child, but recorded information about him stayed at the basic management level, not delving into personal history or family origin. This created a unique state of existence, where the past was not mentioned, not due to deliberate concealment, but because it had never been placed correctly in the current self-narrative. The new environment, with relationships formed over time, gradually became the only reality the victim knew, causing any faint early memories, if remaining, to lack anchors for naming or explanation. The lack of origin information thus did not cause immediate shock, but quietly shaped how the victim viewed himself and the surrounding world, where identity was not a seamless story but a collection of present reality. Living beyond the reach of the missing person file also meant no one questioned his absence from birth registries or other official documents, as administrative loopholes allowed exceptions to exist undetected. In that context, the victim's life continued on its separate trajectory, completely detached from the place he once vanished from, without awareness that in another city, a family still lived with an unfilled void, and a file lingered in vague waiting. Shifting perspective to the victim elsewhere thus was not a sudden story change, but placing two parallel realities side by side, showing how one event created two divergent timelines, one frozen in the investigative system, and the other still flowing in the life of a person unaware that the identity he carried was only part of an unconnected story. Continuing the reality where the victim exists outside any connection to missing persons records, life under the substitute identity gradually takes shape through relationships with a substitute family or guardian who play a central role in creating a new framework for daily living, though one not based on a complete legal foundation. This relationship is not established through full formal procedures, but relies on tacit agreements and acceptance by the surrounding community, where questions about a child's origins are not raised as long as basic needs continue to be met. The substitute family or guardian provides shelter, food, and minimal care, sufficient for the victim to maintain an outwardly stable life, but lacking legally validating elements such as a valid birth certificate or official adoption records. The victim's living conditions and daily routine reflect prolonged temporariness, neither harsh enough to draw attention, nor stable enough to create a sense of long-term security, as all activities revolve around what is necessary for the present, without consideration of future legal or administrative consequence. In this context, the victim's social interactions are naturally limited, not necessarily due to explicit prohibitions, but because living circumstances make expanding relationships difficult, especially in situations requiring detailed personal information. The victim participates in community activities at a minimal level, enough to blend in, but not deeply enough to form bonds that might raise questions about identity, a fragile balance maintained over time without the need for strict oversight. The absence of complete legal records gradually becomes a normal reality in the victim's life, as these gaps do not create immediate obstacles, but always exist as an invisible limit, affecting future access to services and opportunity. Administrative procedures are handled with temporary solutions, sufficient to navigate specific stages, such as school enrollment or basic medical care, but they do not create a continuous, traceable chain of records. In this environment, the victim learns to adapt in silence, accepting the current identity as part of present life, without any basis for comparison or challenge, since no alternative information is provided to prompt question. This adaptation does not occur as a deliberate cognitive process, but as the result of continually adjusting behavior to meet surrounding expectations, from how to answer questions about oneself, to avoiding situations that might expose inconsistencies in the personal narrative. Growing up in an environment where identity is not fully validated leads the victim to develop a high capacity for self-regulation, learning to observe others' reactions and adjust the level of information shared accordingly, not out of fear but because it is the only way to maintain stability. The substitute family or guardian, even if not intending harm, also contributes to reinforcing this state by avoiding procedures that could trigger deeper scrutiny, thereby preserving a status quo convenient for all parties in the short term. The victim's daily life thus unfolds in a closed loop, where immediate needs are addressed, but long-term questions about identity and personal rights are indefinitely postponed. The lack of complete legal records does not create an immediate crisis, but gradually restricts the ability to expand life as the victim grows older, making many options difficult to access or impossible without a clear reason. In this context, silence becomes part of the adaptation mechanism, not conscious concealment, but the only way to avoid disruption in an already fragile system. Life under a false identity, therefore, does not resemble a dramatic escape, but a prolonged existence within quiet limits, where outward stability is traded for the absence of a legal foundation and a clear origin story, causing the victim to continue growing up in a reality built from what is presently available, rather than from the truth about who they once were. Continuing the life maintained under a substitute identity and the quiet limits that accompany it, administrative anomalies begin to accumulate over time as an inevitable consequence of existing outside a complete legal system, though they do not manifest as a clear crisis, but appear sporadically in specific everyday situations. The victim's personal documents are inconsistent from the start, with basic information such as date of birth, place of birth, or family relationships not recorded uniformly across different records, creating a fragmented picture where each piece is only sufficient for a temporary purpose. These discrepancies are not always seen as serious, since in many cases they are explained as administrative errors or lack of updates. But when viewed together over time, they form a discontinuous chain without any original document strong enough to serve as a reference point. In the educational environment, similar issues arise when the victim's enrollment and attendance are based on minimal information, enough to meet immediate requirements, but insufficient to build a complete, traceable academic record. School transfers, changes of residence, or personal information updates occur without an effective cross-referencing mechanism, causing anomalies to go undetected and be treated merely as minor exceptions in a system many accustomed to inconsistent. These limitations affect the learning process indirectly, as some opportunities or programs requiring deeper verification become harder to access, forcing the victim to adapt by choosing paths that demand less documentation or confirmation. In healthcare, inconsistencies in documentation become even more evident, since long-term healthcare often requires complete personal records and medical history, which the victim cannot fully provide. Access to medical services primarily focuses on addressing immediate issues, with information recorded separately at each facility and not linked into a continuous record, turning medical history into a collection of disconnected data fragments that do not fully reflect the individual's development. These gaps do not cause immediate consequences, but weaken the ability to track and provide long-term care, while increasing the risk of errors when information needs to be cross-checked in the future. The legal gray area forms from the combination of these factors, as the victim exists in a limbo between different management systems, neither completely outside the law, nor fully covered by any legal framework. The absence of a valid original record leaves many rights and legal obligations undefined, but because these limitations are not triggered simultaneously, they do not create a conflict large enough to attract the attention of authority. The administrative system, designed to handle large volumes of data and rely on internal consistency, lacks automatic mechanisms to detect such subtle deviations, especially in a context where data is not fully digitized and interagency connectivity remains very limited. Remaining undetected in the system is not the result of sophisticated concealment, but a consequence of structural gaps that allow incomplete cases to exist without triggering alert. Each agency sees only a small part of the picture, enough to process immediate requests, but not enough to question the integrity of the identity, and without connections between those parts, administrative anomalies gradually become the norm. For the victim, existing in this gray area is experienced, not through abstract legal concepts, but through specific limitations in daily life, where some paths always seem harder to access without a clear reason, and some questions about oneself lack clear answers. However, because these anomalies have never converged into a problem large enough to demand root-level resolution, they continue to be sidelined, existing alongside everyday life without fully disrupting it. The system's failure to detect is therefore not a single failure but a prolonged process in which fragmented checks never intersect to form a complete picture. By the end of this phase, administrative anomalies have accumulated into a fragile foundation for the victim's life, but are still not sufficient to expose the truth about the identity on their own, allowing the story to continue drifting in an unrecognized state, where legal and administrative gaps both cause and sustain the separation between the person currently existing and their unconnected past. From the quiet but prolonged administrative anomalies, signs of personal discrepancy gradually form and become clearer over time, not as isolated events, but as a background state that shapes how the victim experiences their own memories, emotions, and behaviors. Memories of early life exist in fragmented form, not connected into a coherent narrative, consisting of vague images, familiar feelings without clear origins, and details that cannot be placed in a specific timeline, turning the past into a collection of unordered fragments. These memories are not clear enough to confirm or deny anything, but also do not completely disappear, persisting as background sensations that sometimes surface without reasonable explanation. Alongside this is a prolonged sense of not belonging, not tied to a specific place or relationship, but present as a subtle misalignment between the victim and their surroundings, where everything external appears stable but internally there is always a lack of solid grounding. This feeling does not manifest as open resistance or crisis, but as constant caution, making it difficult for the victim to fully immerse themselves in relationships or social roles, even though they outwardly meet basic expectations. To adapt to this state, the victim develops unusual adaptive behaviors, not markedly deviant but more subtle, shown through closely observing others' reactions, adjusting speech and actions to fit the context, and avoiding situations that might require deep explanations about themselves. These behaviors gradually become reflexes, helping maintain short-term stability, while also reinforcing an invisible distance between the victim and those around them. The lack of a clear identity foundation is the underlying factor, influencing all these manifestations, as without a consistent origin story to anchor them, answering basic questions about oneself becomes difficult or temporary. Identity is therefore not experienced as a stable concept, but as a collection of roles adjusted according to circumstances, sufficient to meet immediate needs, but lacking continuity or wholeness. This affects how the victim views long-term relationships, as deep attachment becomes harder due to a lack of confidence that they could be fully understood or accepted if the entire story were revealed. These signs of discrepancy come without clear explanation from the surrounding environment, since no one asks direct questions or provides a framework to interpret the state the victim is experiencing. The absence of explanation is not just a lack of information but also a lack of language to name inner experiences, making it hard for the victim to distinguish normal personal feelings from the consequences of a fractured history. Over time, this ambiguity is internalized, becoming part of how the victim understands themselves, where differences are accepted as obvious, rather than seen as signs of a problem needing resolution. Social relationships, though they exist and develop to a certain degree, remain influenced by an invisible distance, as the victim holds back a part of themselves, not out of specific fear but because there is no reference framework for expression. In everyday life, these long-term signs of discrepancy rarely attract others' attention, since they do not clearly violate social norms, but for the victim themselves, they create a lingering sense that something does not fit, though it cannot be named. The absence of a unified explanation means all efforts at self-understanding must rely on personal guesswork, without sufficient data or memories for confirmation, leading to acceptance of the current state as an unchangeable reality. In this context, fragmented memories, the sense of not belonging, unusual adaptive behaviors, and the lack of identity foundation do not exist as separate issues, but intertwine and reinforce each other, forming a stable yet fragile psychological structure. The lack of explanation not only hinders the ability to connect past fragments, but also delays the ability to question the discrepant state itself, allowing it to persist for years without being recognized as the consequence of a specific event. By the end of this phase, the signs of discrepancy have become a familiar part of the victim's inner life, existing alongside an outwardly stable existence, not causing immediate crisis, but quietly shaping how the victim experiences themselves and the world. In a state where everything seems to function normally, but lacks a deep enough explanatory foundation to provide a complete sense of who they are. From a prolonged state of phase discrepancy without explanation, an unexpected modern element emerges and alters the stable yet fragile trajectory of the victim's life, starting with an administrative or medical event that seems ordinary but requires a higher level of identity verification than anything that had occurred before. This event does not arise from direct suspicion or an active investigation, but emerges as a natural consequence of accessing modern services, where requirements for personal information and record consistency have become far stricter than in previous decades. As the procedures are carried out, basic questions about identity begin to arise systematically, no longer limited to minimal information that could be resolved with temporary solutions, but demanding original documents, cross-verification, and confirmation from multiple sources. The identity verification requirement thus becomes a turning point, not because it directly points to anything unusual, but because it forces the entire administrative structure that had existed in a gray area to confront new, unavoidable standards. In the process of meeting this requirement, long-standing deficiencies that had been concealed by the system's fragmentation gradually come to light, as documents cannot be linked into a valid chain and basic information lacks clear origins for cross-checking. To address this situation, the collection of biological samples is proposed as a neutral technical solution, intended to add a layer of objective data independent of paperwork or statements, in line with how modern systems handle cases of administrative inconsistency. This collection process is conducted according to medical or administrative standards, without any investigative tone, with the initial goal simply to complete the stalled verification request. The biological sample taken and processed in this context is not tied to any specific hypothesis about the past, but is treated as supplementary data to complete the current record. After collection, the biological data is entered into the system through standard procedures, becoming part of a modern database designed for broader-scale identity matching and verification compared to older systems. It is at this step that the difference between present and past becomes clear, as data no longer exists in isolated archives, but is connected in a network capable of comparing, detecting, and suggesting links that humans could not identify on their own. Entering the data into the system does not produce immediate results, but it triggers an automated processing chain, where the biological sample is compared against existing datasets according to strict statistical criteria, completely detached from the victim's personal context. In this process, an anomaly begins to appear, not as a clear conclusion, but as a technical indicator showing that the newly entered data does not fully match what the system expects from an independent and complete record. This indicator is neither confirmatory nor negatory, but sufficient to slow the automated processing and shift the record to a state requiring further review, reflecting how modern systems respond to cases outside the norm. The emergence of the anomaly comes without any explanation to the victim at that time, as in the system's operational logic, it is merely an intermediate step needing clarification before a final result. However, structurally, it marks the first time the victim's personal data is placed in a broader context, where the possibility of connection to other records, though not yet identified, becomes a real prospect. This creates a subtle but significant shift, as the identity previously maintained through temporary solutions now must face an objective verification mechanism, independent of subjective explanations or local community acceptance. The anomaly is thus not an emotionally charged or dramatic discovery, but a technical signal indicating something in the data structure does not align with the initial assumption that this is an independent record, unrelated to any other context. At that moment, the administrative or medical event has formally concluded, but its potential consequences continue to operate at a deeper level of the system, where algorithms and comparison processes handle data in ways not directly observable. For the victim, everything seems to proceed within familiar bounds, with no sudden notifications or clear changes in daily life, but objectively, a door has been opened, allowing personal data to enter a larger interconnected space for the first time. This modern activation does not take the form of a moment of realization or an intentional decision, but is the result of the intersection between new system requirements and unresolved old deficiencies, creating a point of contact where a detached past could potentially be drawn back into the realm of recognition. At the end of this phase, though no conclusion or tangible change has occurred, the appearance of the anomaly in the verification process has laid the foundation for a new movement, where identity is no longer maintained solely through silence and adaptation, but begins to come under the light of modern tools, capable of seeing beyond the limits that older systems once accepted. From the anomaly that appears during biological data processing, the system begins to activate deeper comparison steps, leading to the detection of a potential DNA match, not within the scope of ordinary administrative records, but related to an old dataset that had existed for many years. This match is not treated as an immediate conclusion, but as a statistical indicator showing that the newly entered biological sample has a similarity level exceeding the normal threshold, with another record in the system sufficient to require manual review rather than automated processing. This detection occurs quietly in the system's technical layer, without context or story, simply as the intersection of data sequences that had been stored separately and rarely activated simultaneously. Once the potential match is identified, the next step is to narrow down connections to related old records, a process requiring the retrieval of data stored from before modern systems existed, including missing persons records, family DNA data, and biological samples collected in various contexts. This narrowing is not aimed at searching for a specific individual from the start, but at determining the type of record the match might belong to, thereby reducing the review scope to a group of cases sharing geographic, temporal, or circumstantial commonalities. This process highlights the differences between data generations, as older records often lack standardization, are stored in various formats, and do not always include complete information, forcing specialists to rely on indirect criteria to assess relevance. Concurrently, the data is compared on a federal scale, leveraging inter-database connectivity that did not previously exist, allowing the new biological sample to be matched against much larger datasets rather than being limited to one region or agency. This comparison follows strict protocols, with the goal of determining whether the potential match recurs across multiple systems or appears only in an isolated context, thereby assessing whether it is a genuine connection or mere random coincidence. The federal comparison results show sufficient consistency to rule out most technical error possibilities, but still fall short of the threshold for a definitive conclusion, requiring involved parties to proceed with a cautious reliability assessment. This assessment relies not only on statistical probability but also on sample quality, initial data collection conditions, accompanying record completeness, and the potential for interfering factors, such as distant blood relations or missing data. The experts involved must balance not overlooking a meaningful link with avoiding premature conclusions based on unconfirmed data, as the consequences of either choice can be significant. In this context, the potential DNA match is held in a pending verification state, seen as a signal strong enough to continue but not sufficient for independent action, reflecting how modern systems handle cases on the boundary between possibility and certainty. When the reliability level reaches the regulatory threshold, the match-related information is transferred to the appropriate agency for investigation-level review, a critical step, moving the data out of the purely technical space and into a law enforcement context. This information transfer follows strict confidentiality procedures to ensure personal data is accessed only by authorized units and for clear purposes, while preventing the spread of unconfirmed information. At that point, the DNA match is no longer a solitary technical indicator but becomes a potential connection between the present and a past record that had been frozen in the system, though not yet named or tied to a specific story. The emergence of this link does not immediately alter the victim's reality or trigger a public response, but it changes the data's status from passive to capable of guiding action, marking the first time two parallel information streams, existing for years, have the opportunity to be placed side by side in the same analytical framework. The reliability assessment and information transfer are thus not merely technical steps, but a structural intersection, where modern technology begins to bridge past limitations, opening the possibility that a record once seen as unconnectable can now be re-examined in new light, though at this stage everything remains at the level of potential and awaiting, without the form of a conclusion or complete explanation. From the moment the information about the potential DNA match is transferred to the authorized agency, a chain of reverse-connecting actions begins to form, with a focus on retrieving the cold case file in El Paso to determine whether the new data truly relates to a specific past incident or not. The file on Michael Scott's disappearance is pulled from storage, where it had remained inactive for many years, along with numerous paper documents, typed reports, crime scene diagrams, and interview transcripts, preserved according to early 19. This retrieval is not just an administrative task, but a process of reviving a case once considered to have reached the limits of investigative capability, placing it back in a modern context where new data can be systematically compared. Investigators and analysts begin matching the new data against what exists in the old file, from basic details about the time and place of disappearance to minor points previously deemed insufficient to pursue, seeking any intersection between the two previously separate information streams. This matching process occurs in layers, as DNA data is placed alongside demographic information, biological characteristics, and Michael's initial medical records, while disappearance circumstances are compared to assumptions about potential movement and identity changes over time. Determining the match level is not done as a simple comparison, but as an evidence accumulation process, where each small similarity is noted and weighed in the overall picture to avoid relying on a single factor for conclusion. Experts assess the fit between new data and the old file, not only biologically but also in terms of temporal, spatial, and circumstantial logic, evaluating whether the necessary assumptions for these information streams to converge are reasonable in reality. Concurrently with match determination, the review team begins re-examining every detail from 1981, not to repeat the entire original investigation, but to see what was previously unverifiable, now in light of the new data. Gaps in the timeline, unresolved statement contradictions, and hypotheses shelved for lack of evidence are reconsidered, this time not as independent leads, but as background elements that could support or weaken the connection under review. This review requires high caution, as the risk of reinterpreting the past to fit the new data always exists, forcing investigators to clearly distinguish between seeking reasonable consistency and imposing an unconfirmed narrative. In the process, some details once seen as lacking investigative value are now placed in a broader context, where they can serve as supporting pieces not strong enough to stand alone, but contributing to the overall picture. Preparing to reopen the case thus does not happen as an immediate decision, but as an accumulation process, where each comparison and review step aims to answer the core question of whether the new data is sufficient to change the file's status. Internal discussions are held to assess readiness, consider required resources, and define investigative scope if the case is reactivated, with the understanding that reopening a cold case is not just technical but involves complex legal, administrative, and human consequences. In this phase, Michael Scott's file exists in a transitional state, no longer fully passive as before, but not yet officially returned to active investigation, reflecting the necessary caution when new data opens connection possibilities, but has not reached certainty. The linking back to El Paso thus lacks drama or publicity, occurring in the professional space of those tasked with evaluating and preserving the integrity of both new data and old file. For the system, this is a test of responsibly connecting past and present, where each advance must be carefully weighed to avoid errors or unrealistic expectations. By the end of this phase, though no official statement has been issued, preparations to reopen the case have reached a concrete level, as the connection between the DNA data and the El Paso cold case is no longer a vague hypothesis, but a grounded possibility, sufficient to place the once frozen case back at the center of professional attention. Ready for a new phase where the limits of 1981 can be challenged with modern tools and methods. From the cautious preparatory state after the connection between the new data and the old case file reached a feasible threshold, the case was officially transferred to the Cold Case Unit of El Paso, a unit designed to handle backlog cases using systematic methods and specialized resources that the initial investigative teams could not sustain long-term. The handover was not just a change in the lead agency, but a comprehensive restructuring, in which all case documents were gathered, standardized, and placed into a unified workflow, ensuring that every subsequent decision was based on the most complete picture possible. The cold case unit began by reviewing the entire initial investigation, not to criticize previous efforts, but to understand the context, limitations, and logic that guided each step in 1981, from how the scene was established, the timeline constructed, to how hypotheses were formed and eliminated. Every report, transcript, and diagram was re-examined in light of modern data, with the goal of determining what conclusions were reasonable based on the information available at the time and what resulted from technological or resource shortages. The cold case unit reconstructed the case progression as a seamless sequence of events, linking timelines, search activities, witness statements, and administrative decisions into a single logical structure, helping to eliminate the fragmentation that had accumulated over years of dispersed storage. This reconstruction process not only recreated what had happened, but also highlighted the breaking points in the investigative progression, where information was not followed through or where a hypothesis was abandoned due to lack of tools for further verification. Once the progression was restructured, old hypotheses were systematically compared, no longer existing vaguely side by side as before, but placed against each other with clear criteria regarding plausibility, verifiability, and compatibility with new data. Hypotheses once considered too speculative were re-evaluated to see if they could now be supported by modern technology, while those previously prioritized were re-examined to determine if they truly held up when compared to the full current picture. This comparison was not aimed at finding a complete story immediately, but at gradually eliminating incompatible possibilities, thereby narrowing the space for speculation and creating conditions for identifying new investigative direction. The investigators of the cold case unit applied a multidisciplinary approach, combining data analysis, behavioral assessment, and knowledge of crime patterns, to identify points that the initial investigation could not reach due to the limitations of the era. In this process, DNA data was not treated as an independent solution, but as a new pillar that needed to be integrated into the investigative structure, helping to reorient old questions rather than completely replace them. Identifying new investigative directions thus occurred as a filtering process, in which valuable elements from the past were retained and connected to the possibilities opened by modern technology, forming a more clearly targeted investigative roadmap than in the initial phase. The cold case unit also re-evaluated the geographic and temporal scope of the case, considering the possibility that previous assumptions about the scope of the disappearance may have been too narrow or too broad, and adjusting them based on current understanding of movement patterns and identity changes. Reopening the case did not mean starting over from scratch, but repositioning the case within a new analytical framework, where old questions were rephrased differently and data once passive now became starting points for action. In this phase, Michael Scott's file moved from a waiting state to a conditionally active state, with clearly planned steps and predetermined criteria for evaluating progress, to avoid the investigation envelopping into the same deadlock loops as in the past. The reopening process also included establishing appropriate coordination channels, ensuring that any new data collected could be quickly integrated and cross-checked with existing sources, minimizing the risk of information fragmentation. For the cold case unit, this was not just about resolving a specific case, but also a test of the modern approach to files that seemed obscured by time, where success was measured not by speed, but by the ability to build a sustainable and directed investigative process. By the end of the reopening phase, the case had been placed on a new trajectory, with hypotheses rearranged, unsuitable directions eliminated, and some new investigative directions clearly identified, laying the foundation for the next steps in a process where the past was no longer an absolute limit, but became a systematically re-exploitable data component. From the new investigative trajectory established after the cold case unit fully restructured the file, the identity verification step was implemented as a decisive phase, in which all previous hypotheses and accumulated data had to be tested using the most objective methods with the highest legal value. The first focus was conducting direct-line DNA testing, a necessary step to turn a potential match into confirmatory evidence, by comparing the victim's biological sample with samples from living blood relatives in the original El Paso file. This process was carried out according to strict standards, to ensure sample integrity, analysis accuracy, and the possibility of independent retesting if needed, because any error at this stage could undermine the entire investigative process. Parallel to the DNA testing, investigators cross-referenced medical records, focusing on biological data recorded during Michael Scott's childhood, including developmental characteristics, medical history, and personalized markers that might persist long-term, with the goal of finding meaningful similarities or differences when compared to the victim's current medical records. This cross-referencing was not based solely on numbers and diagnoses, but also considered seemingly minor details with high identification value, which may have been overlooked in the initial investigation context due to lack of tools or need. At the same time, other biological information was systematically checked, including physical characteristics, blood type, congenital marks, or genetic indicators that could be compared across different life stages to reinforce or challenge the DNA results within a multidimensional analytical framework. This verification reflected the necessary caution when handling long-term identity change cases, where a single result, even strong, still needed to be placed in a broader context to avoid hasty conclusions. As the biological and medical data were placed side by side, the level of consistency between them began to form a clearer picture, showing similarities exceeding the threshold explainable by randomness or coincidence, while weakening alternative hypotheses previously considered during the case reopening. On that basis, the legal identity confirmation step was implemented, turning scientific analysis results into a conclusion with administrative and legal value, allowing the system to officially recognize that the victim's current identity did not reflect their true origin. This process required coordination between investigative units, forensic agencies, and civil management authorities to ensure that the confirmation was not only scientifically correct, but also compliant with current legal regulations, especially in cases involving missing children and long-term identity changes. The procedures were conducted carefully, including preparing verification files, recording test results, cross-referencing with historical data, and preparing necessary documents to formalize the conclusion, all to avoid future disputes or doubt. When all necessary elements were completed, the identity verification process reached its technical conclusion, with the system officially recognizing the connection between the current victim and the Michael Scott file in El Paso, no longer as a hypothesis or possibility, but as a confirmed fact. The completion of verification was not dramatic or immediately public, but occurred within a professional framework, reflecting how modern systems handle weighty conclusions cautiously and controlled. For the investigative process, this was a significant shift from seeking answers to dealing with the consequences of those answers, as the identity had been clarified and no longer lay in the gray area of data. This confirmation also closed a long phase where two unconnected identities existed in parallel and laid the foundation for subsequent decisions based on a fully verified truth. Immediately after the identity was fully and legally verified, the focus of the process shifted from data analysis to the human element, requiring involved agencies to plan an approach to the victim, with caution to minimize psychological trauma and avoid unforeseen legal consequences. The approach was not seen as a simple notification, but as a carefully prepared process, in which investigators, psychologists, and legal advisors coordinated to determine the timing, method, and scope of information appropriate to the victim's specific circumstance. The approach plan was built based on understanding the victim's current life, psychological stability, existing relationships, and potential risks if the information was delivered suddenly or without necessary support. Parallel to planning, psychological and legal preparation was implemented, including identifying rights and legal obligations arising from identity confirmation, as well as anticipating possible psychological reactions when the victim faced the truth about their origin. Psychologists assessed risks of psychological shock, emotional disorders, or identity crisis, thereby proposing appropriate support measures during and after notification. Legally, involved parties reviewed potential issues related to the current identity, privacy rights, and legal relationships with the substitute family or guardians to ensure that notification did not create legal gaps or conflicts of interest. When all necessary elements were prepared, the true identity notification was carried out according to the established plan, with the focus on providing information clearly, accurately, and controlled, avoiding overwhelming the victim with too many details at once, or placing them in a position to make immediate decisions. Information was presented in a logical sequence, starting with basic confirmations of identity, origin, and reason for the approach, before delving deeper into the historical context of the disappearance and the verification process that had taken place, to allow the victim sufficient time to absorb and process each layer of information. Throughout the notification process, the victim's initial reactions were closely monitored, not to judge right or wrong, but to identify signs indicating the level of acceptance, coping ability, and immediate support need. These reactions could range from confusion, denial, silence, to cautious acceptance, and each manifestation was considered reasonable in the context of a life-changing truth revealed after years in ambiguity. Assessing initial reactions did not end at the notification moment, but continued in the hours and days afterward, as the victim began linking new information to prior personal experiences, potentially awakening fragmented memories or unexplained emotions. Based on these assessments, subsequent steps were arranged flexibly, not following a rigid roadmap, to meet the victim's actual needs rather than imposing a predetermined process. These steps included providing ongoing psychological support, clearly explaining available legal options, and determining an appropriate pace for any actions related to reconnecting with the past or changing legal status. Throughout the approach and notification phase, the guiding principle was prioritizing the victim's safety and autonomy, avoiding turning the process into a procedural or purely investigative event. Involved agencies recognized that identity verification, though a significant achievement legally and investigatively, was only the starting point for a series of profound personal consequences that the victim must face alone. Therefore, arranging subsequent steps was done with the goal of creating a sustainable support framework, allowing the victim to approach the truth at their own pace, while ensuring that all future decisions were made on the basis of full understanding and necessary support. The approach and notification phase, thus, not only marked the transfer of information, but also the intersection between investigative conclusions and an individual's personal journey, where the truth was revealed not to close the story, but to open a new adaptation process that needed to be guided with caution, respect, and responsibility. From the phase of cautious approach and notification, the process transitions to arranging a meeting between the victim and the biological family as an inevitable but not rushed step, since this is the moment when legal truth begins to directly collide with human emotions accumulated over many years. Organizing the meeting is not viewed as a merely symbolic event, but as a process that requires thorough psychological, logistic, and legal preparation to ensure that both the victim and the biological family have sufficient information, time, and support to enter this moment with realistic expectation. The involved parties jointly agree on a neutral location, suitable timing, and scope of participation, avoiding placing the victim in a situation of being overwhelmed by too many emotions at once or drawn into a performative script. When the meeting takes place, the focus is not on recreating the past or explaining all the lost years, but on confirming the biological relationship proven by scientific and legal data, laying the foundation for a new connection rather than attempting to restore an interrupted relationship from when the victim was a child. This confirmation occurs not only through words or emotions, but also through necessary procedures for both sides to be officially recognized as family in records and in reality, helping shift the connection from a state of discovery to one of legal and sustainable existence. Alongside this is the start of the identity re-establishment process, where the victim begins confronting the integration of the newly confirmed legal identity into their current life, not by completely erasing what existed before, but by building a broader identity structure that includes both the interrupted past and the formed present. This process requires subtle adjustments, as identity is not just a name or documents, but also tied to self-perception, position in the family, and social role, all of which need time to be meaningfully rearranged. For the biological family, reunion does not mean continuing the relationship from where it was interrupted, but learning to build a new relationship with an adult who carries experiences, values, and attachments different from what they had imagined during their long wait. This leads to adjusting family roles, as parent-child and sibling relationships cannot return to their original form but must be redefined to fit current reality, where boundaries, expectations, and levels of attachment need to be re-established respectfully. This adjustment process does not happen in a single moment, but as a series of prolonged interactions where both sides learn to recognize each other's limits, accept gaps that cannot be filled immediately, and gradually build trust. To support this complex process, professional support forms are implemented in parallel, including individual psychological counseling for the victim, family support for biological members, and joint sessions to create a safe space for sharing emotions without pressure to achieve a specific outcome. Experts act more as guides than directors, helping the parties understand that reunion is not the end of a journey, but the start of a new phase with its own challenges. In this phase, important decisions regarding living together or maintaining distance, changing legal documents or keeping part of the current structure, are carefully considered, without imposition or haste, to ensure each step stems from the victim's true readiness. The presence of professional support also helps minimize the risk of over-idealizing the reunion moment, instead encouraging a realistic perspective where joy, relief, and difficult emotions coexist without denying each other. For the victim, reunion opens the possibility of placing fragmented memories into a context with names and meaning, though this does not mean all questions are answered immediately. For the biological family, it is the end of a period of uncertain waiting, but also the beginning of a relationship that must be built from scratch, with the understanding that lost time cannot be reclaimed. Throughout the entire reunion process, the key factor is not speed or form, but the ability to allow each side to enter this new relationship with the right to hesitate, adjust, and redefine their role. Reunion is therefore not seen as a moment that closes the story, but as an intersection where past and present coexist, creating conditions for re-establishing identity and relationships in a way that most truthfully reflects what was lost and what remains to be built upon. From the moment reunion is established as an intersection between past and present, the post-reunion phase quickly reveals that finding the biological family does not mean all wounds or voids are naturally closed, but opens a chain of long-term psychological consequences that require time and systematic support to handle. For the victim, knowing who they truly are and where they come from creates a profound shift in self-perception, while stirring complex emotions such as loss, anger, sadness, and confusion, not because the reunion failed, but because it forces confrontation with the reality that part of life passed without choice or understanding. These emotions do not appear all at once, but intermittently, sometimes conflicting with relief and gratitude for surviving and having the chance to connect, creating a fluctuating psychological state that needs professional recognition and handling. The biological family, despite waiting for many years, also faces its own psychological consequences, as the image of the missing child no longer matches the adult, now present, forcing them to adjust expectations and learn to accept that the return cannot fully compensate for the lost years. In this context, therapy and support become an essential part of the post-reunion phase, not just for the victim, but for the entire related family system, to create a safe space for processing emotions without pressure to reach a normal state in a short time. Support forms are implemented diversely, from individual therapy to help the victim integrate the new identity with old experiences, to family counseling to assist parties in building appropriate communication and boundaries, avoiding recreating trauma through unrealistic expectations or prolonged silence. Adapting to the true identity occurs as a multi-layered process, as the victim confronts legal, social, and internal changes simultaneously, from using the real name and adjusting documents to answering questions about themselves that were never faced before. Identity is no longer an abstract or temporary concept, but a structure that needs rebuilding on the foundation of truth, which both brings a sense of liberation and creates new pressure when integrating the interrupted past into the current life story. This process is not linear, with periods where the victim feels clear progress in acceptance and integration, but also times when feelings of disconnection return, especially when facing important life milestones like work, intimate relationships, or long-term decisions. Alongside this is the effort to stabilize the new life, including re-establishing daily habits, strengthening social relationships, and finding balance between past and present without letting one deny the other. The biological family and the family that raised the victim for many years, if still in contact, must also adjust roles and levels of involvement in the victim's life, a complex process requiring mutual respect and expert support to avoid conflict or feelings of replacement. Although many factors gradually stabilize, persistent difficulties cannot be downplayed, as they reflect the depth of prolonged trauma and the complexity of rebuilding life after an unchosen event. These difficulties may include guilt when reconnecting with the biological family while still attached to the previously built life, anxiety about public knowledge of the personal story, or fatigue from constantly explaining and adjusting to administrative and social changes. In many cases, external pressure, even from concern or goodwill, can increase stress, as the victim is expected to show gratitude, happiness, or a happy ending in a mold that does not fully reflect inner reality. Maintaining long-term support is therefore no less important than the initial phase, helping parties understand that adaptation has no clear endpoint but is an ongoing process of adjustment through life stages. In this context, post-reunion is not viewed as a short transitional phase, but as an inseparable part of the recovery and reshaping journey, where stability is built gradually through accepting existing limits alongside new possibilities. Difficulties do not disappear completely, but when placed in an appropriate support framework, they become manageable challenges rather than insurmountable barriers. For the victim, continuing to live with the true identity is not just a legal change, but a process of learning to allow oneself to exist fully with both what was lost and what remains, in a life that cannot be rewritten but can be re-understood in a way that brings greater meaning and long-term stability. From the post-reunion context, where focus gradually shifts to stabilizing life and handling personal consequences, the question of the perpetrator and legal responsibility inevitably arises in a cautious and realistic manner, as confirming the victim's identity simultaneously reactivates the need to consider whether the justice system can still pursue criminal accountability after decades. The process of identifying potential suspects begins by reviewing all historical data focusing on individuals who appeared in statements, those with access to the victim during the critical period, and connections previously deemed insufficient for pursuit when the case was in initial investigation. This identification aims not to quickly point to a specific individual, but to build a plausible list based on logical criteria of opportunity, access, and behavior fitting the circumstances, while excluding verified unrelated cases. However, once the list is formed, the investigation team quickly faces major challenges in evaluating remaining evidence, as most physical evidence from the time either was not collected or not preserved to standards usable after decades. Witness statements, already vague initially, become even harder to verify as memories fade. Involved people are gone or unable to accurately recall, significantly reducing their probative value. Administrative documents and initial investigation reports, though preserved, reflect the era's limitations in technology and methods, not providing enough data for a solid modern prosecution case. In this context, evidence evaluation is not just examining what remains, but acknowledging what is permanently lost over time, from crime scene traces to irretrievable investigation opportunities. Alongside evidence limitations are legal limits due to time, as many prosecution frameworks are governed by statutes of limitations or transitional rules not allowing retroactive application of new standards to past acts. Though some serious crimes may have no statute of limitations, proving elements after years remains a major barrier, especially without direct evidence and reliable witnesses. Consulted prosecutors must weigh realistic prosecution feasibility, based not only on bringing the case to trial, but on achieving a fair and sustainable outcome, avoiding initiating a case likely to be suspended or acquitted due to lack of evidence, causing further harm to the victim and family. In this process, potential suspects, even identified to some degree, cannot be assigned legal responsibility without solid basis, reflecting the core justice system principle that certainty must exceed reasonable doubt. This consideration forces involved parties to face a hard-to-accept reality. Not all truths can be transformed into legal judgments, especially when time has eroded necessary foundations for prosecution. Unresolvable points become clear, including inability to precisely determine the chain of actions leading to the victim's removal from the initial environment, prove specific roles in the early interrupted life, or fully reconstruct the psychological context and motives of those involved at the time. The absence of these answers is not due to current indifference or lack of effort, but the cumulative result of overlapping historical, technical, and legal limits over decades. For the victim, facing the possibility of no specific prosecution poses a separate psychological challenge, as the need for acknowledgement and accountability is not always met through legal paths, forcing them to seek closure in other ways beyond the courtroom. The biological family, desiring clear responsibility answers, must accept that the system can only go as far as data allows, and lack of prosecution does not mean denying what happened. Internally, investigation agencies record prosecution limit conclusions transparently in records, ensuring decisions are based on objective analysis and reviewable if new evidence emerges. This process does not completely close the door on accountability, but sets a clear boundary between what is possible now and what is beyond law's reach. Determining that boundary, though difficult, is necessary to avoid prolonging unrealistic expectations and causing further harm to those who have suffered enough. By the end of this phase, the picture of perpetrator and legal responsibility is shaped, not by an indictment, but by frank acknowledgement of insurmountable limits, where legal justice may be incomplete, but the truth about identity and the victim's survival journey has been irrevocably confirmed. From acknowledging insurmountable prosecution limits, the formal investigation process reaches the final evaluation phase, where the case is reviewed in its full historical length to determine appropriate legal status, and in this case, the Michael Scott file is classified as solved in the professional sense, though not leading to a specific criminal conviction. Classifying the case as solved is not based on identifying and punishing a perpetrator, but on the core criterion that the central question has been definitively answered. The victim's identity has been verified, the fate of the missing person clarified, and decades-long uncertainty ended by irreversible scientific and legal evidence. In this process, investigators and legal experts particularly emphasize the distinction between solved and closed, terms often misunderstood as equivalent, but with entirely different meanings in law enforcement. A closed case may simply mean no longer pursued due to lack of leads or legal barriers, while a solved case reflects resolution of the core question regardless of prosecution outcome. In this instance, the case was previously cold not due to lack of effort, but lack of tools, and its solved classification after years highlights the fundamental difference between temporary impasse and true conclusion of a truth-seeking process. This decision is officially recorded in the El Paso PD system, accompanied by detailed summaries of reopening, identity verification, and prosecution evaluation, ensuring solved status is not just an administrative label, but a conclusion based on the full chain of data and analysis. The impact on the cold case system is significant, reinforcing the role of modern technology, especially DNA and federal databases, as tools capable of breaking limits faced by traditional investigation. This case becomes a typical example, showing cold cases are not permanently unsolvable, but a waiting state where records are preserved until suitable tools appear. It also shows that cold case success should not be measured solely by prosecutions, but by providing authentic answers to lingering questions, especially in child missing persons cases. For law enforcement agencies, the outcome reinforces the importance of careful record storage, biological data preservation, and long-term accessibility, as details seemingly insignificant at one time can become decisive decades later. Implications for similar cases are clearly recognized, as the Michael Scott case illustrates that disappearances without clear violent signs, once deemed unsolvable, can still be clarified if victim identity persists and data is properly connected. It sends a realistic but not overly optimistic message. Not all cases end in conviction, but many can end in truth, and in many instances, that truth is enough for necessary closure for victim and family. Within the cold case system, this case helps reshape success evaluation, encouraging units to focus not only on perpetrators, but also on determining fate and identity, especially as more citizens participate in biological and genealogical databases. Closing the investigation is not a dramatic event or celebratory announcement, but a cautious administrative and professional step, ensuring all conclusions are fully recorded and reviewable if needed. The file is updated to solved status, involved units complete final report, and follow-up responsibility shifts from active investigation to long-term storage and monitoring, reflecting that while the case is resolved on its central question, its personal and social consequences persist beyond investigation scope. For the victim, investigation conclusion does not mark the end of personal journey, but official system confirmation of what their life had begun processing. Truth about identity and past no longer shrouded in silence. For the biological family, this conclusion provides a form of closure different from traditional justice, where prolonged waiting is replaced by certainty, though imperfect. For the system, it is proof that cold case investment is not futile, but a long-term commitment to truth, even if accessible only after decades. As the formal investigation closes, the Michael Scott case no longer exists as a question mark in the system, but as a complete file fully reflecting both investigation limits and capabilities across generations. This conclusion does not erase what was lost or provide all desired answers, but establishes a clear stopping point for the agency's truth-seeking process, where the central question is answered, and the file placed in a state reflecting its true nature. A case solved in terms of truth, though legal justice may be incomplete, and that very distinction is key to allowing the system to close the investigation transparently, responsibly, and realistically. The story of Michael Scott clearly reflects many issues still present in American life today, from how society views child safety, the role of administrative systems, to the limits and power of modern technology. In 1981 in El Paso, family and community believed a peaceful neighborhood was enough to protect young children, and that very belief created fatal moments of hesitation when the first abnormality was not seen as real danger. This lesson remains fully relevant in modern America. Safety does not come from familiarity, but from responsible vigilance, especially with children. The story also reveals another vulnerability. Michael was able to live for decades under a false identity not due to a sophisticated plot, but because of a fragmented administrative system, lacking interconnection between states and agencies. In today's America, where digital data, DNA, and federal records increasingly play central roles, the lesson is not to fear technology, but to understand it only realizes value when data is carefully stored and people are willing to use it responsibly. The resolution of Michael's cold case through modern DNA shows the importance of preserving records, participating in identification systems when appropriate, and not viewing administrative procedures as meaningless. Finally, Michael's post-reunion journey reminds us that a happy ending does not mean the end of trauma. In American society where individualism is emphasized, this story encourages empathy. Do not expect victims to be strong, grateful, or stable immediately. Justice sometimes comes not from the courtroom, but from society accepting the truth, respecting the recovery process, and creating space for people to rebuild their lives at their own pace. If you find Michael Scott's story reminds us of the value of truth, memory, and hope that never fades, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining those cases, seemingly forgotten, but still waiting to be illuminated. Thank you for following to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue delving into cold cases that have forever changed people's lives.